Salvete omnes. I wanted to do a brief discussion around Seneca's Thyestes to talk again briefly about an important theme that we introduced when talking about Seneca, which was incorporating elements of horror into the tragedy, and how that essentially helps us understand Seneca's perspective on vengeance and how that fits into his worldview as a way to punish wrong that has been done. So let's quickly do a little review of the messaging we've gotten around vengeance in the tragedies that we've read previously. So from the Oresteia, we talked pretty extensively about how the gods essentially mandate that vengeance be taken for certain crimes that are committed, especially murder when committed between family members. In our next unit, we read plays that were mostly situated around marriages, the women of Trachis, Medea, and Hippolytus. And what we saw in these plays were that women were often sort of activated as agents of vengeance, even though they weren't necessarily connected to the original harm that was done that needed to be avenged. Medea, of course, is a slightly different situation or a different character in that she herself takes vengeance for harm that was done directly to her, but Deianira and Phaedra are sort of used as agents by the gods or by centaurs, in Deianira's case, to enact vengeance against a hero or a different character. We also see the presence of the gods in these stories, most specifically the presence of Eros, the god of love, or more particularly the god of sex, who in some ways destabilizes the feelings and the way that the women are perceiving their role in society. Eros is often depicted as a disease, as an illness, and it's the uncertainty that this sort of illness brings and the instability to the family that often leads to the acts that are perceived as being vengeful. Okay, so when we get to Thyestes, though, and to Seneca in general, what we find is that Seneca often depicts vengeance as something that is undesirable. It is not mandated by the gods in the same way that it is in the Oresteia, and it's not the result of love or insecurity, or even you won't see women being used in the same way to kind of avenge old crimes as you would in Euripides or Sophocles. So Seneca takes a completely different tack when talking about vengeance, and that's what we're going to dig into today. So we started our unit on Seneca, and I know we're only reading Thyestes now, but the point was to investigate why use elements of horror to amplify this theme of vengeance and to add to this story. And we talked about the various ways that horror can be incorporated into a narrative. And I wanted to point out a few ways that Seneca does this himself in Thyestes. So two things that really stuck out to me as I was reading was the way that he builds a sense of suspense and foreboding into the story, especially through Thyestes himself, who seems to always be suspicious that something just isn't right. Certainly the setting plays a large role in this, especially in the fourth act when we have the messenger describe exactly how Atreus kills his nephews and really lingers on a lot of the details of the place where that happened, as well as the details of the murders themselves and eventually the cooking of their flesh. So it's a very explicitly narrated, a very graphically narrated scene, and the setting where it takes place certainly adds to that feeling of eeriness and revulsion. There are elements of the supernatural that are present in the story, most especially the Fury, who at the beginning of the story is sort of activating this curse on the family of the house of Atreus by talking to Atreus's grandfather, Tantalus, and sort of urging him to fury and anger that he's going to then pass on to his grandson. But I think most especially we see elements of horror in the character of Atreus. So one last note on horror before we move forward. Remember, one of the things that we we said that Seneca in Roman tragedy was doing in a lot of ways, was competing with some of the other entertainments that were present and available for the Romans at these feast days. So they had the option to go see some other relatively graphic violence at the chariot races, at the Colosseum, at gladiator fights. Violence was very present in this world, and Seneca found ways within his story to sensationalize that and to offer the same kind of thrills that audience members would have seen at other sorts of entertainments. But for now, let's dive back into the character of Atreus going forward. So what we see in Atreus over the course of the play is an interesting combination of a man who appears to be taking sincere pleasure out of plotting the demise of his brother and his family, and who in some cases seems to veer over into what we would consider to be evil, right? Maliciousness without cause, or maliciousness without reason, just maliciousness for the sake of maliciousness. So there's a few passages I wanted to point out to you to really highlight this point or these points, and to kind of see how Seneca builds on this idea that there's something about Atreus that simply is not right. So at the very beginning, in his first scene in Act 2, Atreus is talking to his attendant, and he's essentially laying out for his attendant and for us, the audience, why he's upset and what plan he's planning to undertake. And his attendant asks, "What will you do?" And Atreus answers, "Something huge and awful I cannot yet imagine, but I can feel it growing in my hands that tingle with it. My lively fingers quiver. I cannot name it, but it calls out to something in my soul that answers, yes, so be it." And he's describing here this impulse to violence, an impulse to evil that he can't put a name to, and he can't really understand, but something he feels viscerally inside himself. And that physical reaction is expounded upon a bit when in the third act, Thyestes and his sons have returned, and Atreus has a moment to sort of reflect on the kind of psychosomatic experiences he's having. And he says, "My spirit's alive, my heart sings, my nerves are on fire, but all in pleasure. It's rage, bloodlust in the sight of blood, and it's just unbearably fine. How lovely to gaze on that unlovely face I have longed to see before me. How can I hide my feelings? And yet I must, to draw out the pleasure, to keep the game going longer." So Atreus is reflecting on how he does feel intense pleasure by enacting these real cruel plots and schemes against his brother. So after, in Act 5, very long act, that's kind of the conclusion to, and the giant sort of resolution to what Atreus has done. After he commits this crime, Atreus has another really interesting reflection on how he's feeling after he has done this. And he says, "I know now how the gods must feel. Their power sings along my nerves. I thrilled to their giddy altitude, as if I peered down from heaven to watch as the tiny figures of men scurry on what they take to be paths of important purpose. No god remains but only myself, my pure will imposing itself on the world in all the detail they wanted not to witness." Right, so he's expressing delusions of grandeur at this point. By completing this act and by, seeing this through to the end, he's feeling something intense, and he's feeling as though he has the power of the gods. All right, and then finally, one of the last interchanges he has with Thyestes, Atreus, and when everything has been made clear what has happened, Atreus begins to reflect a little bit on how ultimately his plans played out. And he says, "I hurried. It was all too quick, too easy. I drove my sword into their bodies there at the altar. They died at once and never saw what happened after. They could not see me tear their bodies apart, didn't watch as I stuck their livers on spits and roasted them over the fire, could not hear the sputtering sounds of cooking, and neither did you. I should have preferred that you watch me prepare your banquet, slicing the meat and arranging it here on the platter. I should have delighted to see you chew and swallow, knowing what food you were eating." So there's, in some ways, a sense of disappointment and unfulfillment. Even though he did exactly what he wanted to do, in some ways it still wasn't enough, right? He wanted Thyestes to suffer even more, and now he's imagining what else he could have done to make that pain more exquisite. All right, so I've been thinking about how to present this to you, and it occurred to me that, today, if we were to reflect on Atreus's character, we would pretty quickly label him as a psychopath. Right, so I'm pulling from an article from Psychology Today that is describing how the DSM is starting to diagnose psychopathy as part of their sort of subsection of antisocial behaviors. So there's a link to this article in Canvas for you to read. But what I wanted us to take a quick look at are some of these characteristics that we see in Atreus that we today would recognize as psychopathic behaviors. So in particular, grandiosity, pathological lying, and the manipulation of others, a lack of empathy. I would also say things like committing a variety of crimes, a lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect. All of these things Atreus seems to be displaying. And just to sort of amplify that a little bit, the same author wrote another article about telling the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. Again, very interesting and linked in Canvas if you like to read. But I think that first line is really critical. Psychopaths, on the other hand, are unable to form emotional attachments or feel real empathy with others, although they often have disarming or even charming personalities. They are extremely manipulative and can easily gain people's trust. They learn to mimic emotions despite their inability to actually feel them, and will appear normal to unsuspecting people. So I think that Seneca, even though he probably didn't have a notion of what psychopathy is, or to understand it in that way, created in Atreus a truly magnificent psychopath. Right? Atreus demonstrates almost all of these diagnostic measures in the behavior that he shows towards Thyestes, and especially that desire to manipulate and those illusions of grandeur and grandiosity. So, what does all of this mean when we talk about these elements of horror, these unsettling characters, displaying signs of psychopathy, and Seneca trying to put a new spin on vengeance? So I'm going to ask you to recall some of the things we said about Stoicism. Right? Stoicism essentially is the desire to remain free from passion. Passions being strong emotions of any kind, not necessarily only anger, but here, of course, we are dealing pretty specifically with anger. Seneca believed that anger was one of the most dangerous of the passions because it's very seductive, it brings great pleasure, and it's ultimately unsatisfying. So we can see all three of these sort of qualities in Thyestes, where Atreus and even Tantalus, to an extent, were kind of seduced by the madness of the fury and allowed to give over to their passion. Atreus derived great pleasure from being evil, from being manipulative, from plotting all of these sufferings. And it was something that he physically reacted to as well as mentally reacted to. But as we saw at the end, it was ultimately unsatisfying because even though the act was done, he did it exactly how he planned to. He couldn't help but think what else he could have done. It's something that passion can never truly be satisfied. There's no way for it to be done. So what Seneca is essentially leading us to is this idea that vengeance is the product of anger and should be avoided. Vengeance is not the same as punishment, which is a retributive action based in reason. And so what he's pushing us to understand is that the pursuit of vengeance eventually leads to a bad or unstable rule. So rulers who pursue vengeance based in anger instead of punishment based in reason, right, are not only putting themselves at risk, as we see with Atreus, but also their community. And here we see this implicit and explicit criticism of Nero. Okay, Take care, y'all, and I'll talk to you soon. Walete.